A desperate woman answers the wrong job ad and discovers she wasn't hired by accident. She was chosen by a 6-year-old child playing matchmaker from beyond her dead mother's grave. What happens when grief, loneliness, and a little girl's secret plan collide on an isolated ranch where nothing is what it seems? Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside Dodge City in a cloud of yellow dust, and Elizabeth Hartley climbed down with nothing but a worn canvas bag and a newspaper clipping folded so many times the creases had started to tear. 27 years old and already carrying the weight of someone twice her age, she stood on the boardwalk and let the wind pull at her dark hair while she tried to convince herself this wasn't the worst decision she'd ever made. The ad had been simple, almost too simple. Cook needed. Isolated ranch, room and board, Inquire Calhoun Ranch, 10 miles west of Dodge. No mention of wages, no details about the work, just those bare facts printed in smudged ink at the bottom of the classified section, wedged between advertisements for patent medicine and a reward notice for a stolen horse. Elizabeth had torn it out 3 weeks ago, back when the bank foreclosed on her boarding house in Kansas City, and she'd realized she had exactly 2 choices: find work or starve. She chose work. The problem was that nobody wanted to hire a woman whose last employer had died of cholera, whose references were all dead or scattered, and who had the kind of face that made people nervous, too serious, too sharp, like she could see right through whatever lies they were preparing to tell her. She'd tried for respectable positions first: housekeeper for a banker's wife in Topeka, cook for a hotel in Abilene, even a seamstress job in a dress shop that smelled like lavender and made her want to scream. Nobody wanted her. So she'd answered the ad that nobody else probably wanted either, because any job listing that didn't mention money and emphasized isolated was either desperate or dangerous. Maybe both. Elizabeth walked into the telegraph office and asked the clerk where she could find someone heading toward the Calhoun Ranch. The man looked up from his desk, a middle-aged fellow with ink stains on his fingers and a mustache that drooped like it was tired of being on his face. "Calhoun Ranch?" he repeated. "That's right. You got business out there?" I answered an advertisement. The clerk's eyebrows went up. "For the cook position?" "Yes." He leaned back in his chair and gave her a long look, the kind that made Elizabeth's spine stiffen. She was used to being evaluated, judged, dismissed, but this was different. This man wasn't sizing her up like she was a hired hand or a charity case. He was looking at her like she'd just volunteered to walk into a house that was on fire. "You know about the place?" he asked carefully. "I know it's a ranch." "It's more than that." He scratched his jaw. "Jacob Calhoun's a hard man. Lost his wife 2 years back. Keeps to himself mostly. The little girl, Emma, that's her name, she's strange, real strange." Elizabeth felt a prickle of unease, but kept her face neutral. "Strange how?" "Just strange. Won't talk to most folks. Stares at people like she's reading their thoughts." He shook his head. "They've gone through 4 cooks in the last year. None of them lasted more than a month." "Why not?" "Can't say for sure. Some said the work was too hard. Some said the girl gave them the creeps. One woman swore the house was cursed." He shrugged. "Could be they just didn't like living that far from town. It's 10 miles out, and the road's not easy." Elizabeth absorbed this information without flinching. A hard man, a strange child, and a house that might be cursed. Wonderful. But she'd come too far to turn back now, and pride was a stubborn thing. She'd rather face a cursed house than admit defeat. "I still need to get there," she said. The clerk sighed. "There's a supply wagon leaving in an hour. Driver's name is Pete. He'll take you if you don't mind riding with flour sacks." "I don't mind." An hour later, Elizabeth was sitting on a wagon bench next to a man who smelled like whiskey and talked too much. Pete was a wiry fellow in his 50s, with a face like tanned leather and a habit of spitting tobacco juice over the side of the wagon every few minutes. He spent the first mile asking her questions she didn't want to answer: where she was from, why she was going to the Calhoun Ranch, whether she had family waiting somewhere, and when she gave him short, clipped responses, he eventually gave up and started talking about himself instead. She didn't listen. Instead, she watched the landscape change as they moved farther from Dodge City. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees. The The sky stretched out above them, enormous and blue, broken only by a few clouds that looked like they'd been painted on with a careless hand. It was beautiful in a lonely sort of way, and Elizabeth felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since the day the bank came to take her building. Maybe out here, in all this emptiness, she could finally breathe. The ranch appeared just before sunset, rising out of the hills like it had been there since the beginning of time. It wasn't grand, not the kind of place you'd see in a painting or read about in a book, just a two-story house made of weathered wood, a barn that leaned slightly to one side, and a few outbuildings scattered across the property like someone had tossed them there and forgotten to arrange them properly. Fences stretched out in uneven lines, some sagging, some patched with mismatched boards. A windmill creaked in the distance, turning slow and reluctant. It looked tired. Pete pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and gestured toward the porch. "There you go. Good luck." Elizabeth climbed down, her legs stiff from the ride, and grabbed her bag. "Thank you." "You sure about this?" Pete asked, squinting at her. "I can take you back to town. No charge." "I'm sure." He shrugged. "Suit yourself." The wagon rattled away, leaving Elizabeth standing alone in the yard. She looked up at the house and felt that unease return, sharper this time. The windows were dark. No smoke came from the chimney. The front door was closed, and there was something about the stillness of the place that felt wrong, like the house was holding its breath. She walked up the porch steps, her boots echoing on the wood, and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, louder this time, and waited. Still nothing. Elizabeth was about to knock a third time when the door swung open, and she found herself looking at a man who seemed like he'd been carved out of stone. Jacob Calhoun was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could break a fence post in half without much effort. His hair was dark, cut short and practical, and his face was all hard lines and sharp angles. He had the kind of eyes that didn't give anything away, the color of winter clouds, and when he looked at her, Elizabeth felt like he was measuring her worth in the span of a heartbeat. "You the cook?" he asked. His voice was low and rough, like gravel underfoot. "Elizabeth Hartley," she said, keeping her chin up. "I answered the advertisement." "You're late." "The ad didn't specify a time." "Should have been here yesterday." Elizabeth felt a flash of irritation but swallowed it. "I came as soon as I could." Jacob studied her for another moment, and she had the distinct impression he was about to send her away. Then he stepped back and jerked his head toward the interior of the house. "Come in." She followed him inside, and the first thing she noticed was the smell. Not unpleasant exactly, but stale, like a house that hadn't been properly aired out in months. The front room was dim, the curtains drawn, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been dusted since the previous century. A staircase led up to the second floor, and off to the left, she could see a doorway that probably led to the kitchen. Jacob closed the door behind her and stood with his arms crossed, looking like he regretted letting her in. "You cooked before?" he asked. "Yes." "Where?" "A boarding house in Kansas City." "Why'd you leave?" "The owner died. The bank took the property." "You got references?" "No." His expression didn't change, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Doubt, maybe, or annoyance. "No references." "The people I worked for are either dead or gone," Elizabeth said flatly. "If that's a problem, I'll leave." Jacob didn't respond right away. He just looked at her, and Elizabeth had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see straight through her, past the pride and the exhaustion and the fear she was trying so hard to hide. She wanted to look away, but didn't. She'd learned a long time ago that looking away was the same as admitting weakness, and she couldn't afford that. Finally, he nodded. "You'll work 6 days a week, Sundays off. I need 3 meals a day, breakfast at dawn, lunch at noon, supper at 6. You'll clean the house, do the washing, and keep things in order. Rooms upstairs, second door on the left. You'll share the kitchen, but don't touch anything that's not yours." "And the wages?" Elizabeth asked. "Room and board, plus $20 a month." It was less than she'd hoped for, but more than she'd feared. She nodded. "That's acceptable." "Good." Jacob started to turn away, then paused. "One more thing. My daughter doesn't like strangers. She might not talk to you. Don't take it personal." "I won't." He left without another word, his boots heavy on the floor as he disappeared through a side door. Elizabeth stood alone in the front room, her bag still clutched in one hand, and tried to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. This was a mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. She climbed the stairs, found the room Jacob had mentioned, and pushed open the door. It was small and plain, a narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair by the window, but it was clean. The bed had been made with military precision, the blanket pulled tight, and there was a faint smell of lye soap in the air, like someone had scrubbed the floor recently. Elizabeth set her bag down and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was thin but not uncomfortable. She looked around the room at the bare walls and the empty washstand and felt something close to relief. It wasn't much, but it was hers. For now, at least. She was about to stand up when she heard it, a small, soft sound from the hallway, like a footstep, but lighter, almost hesitant. Elizabeth turned toward the door and saw her. The girl was standing in the doorway, half hidden by the frame, watching her with wide, unblinking eyes. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with pale blonde hair pulled back in a braid and a face that was too serious for a child. She wore a simple dress, faded and patched at the hem, and her hands were clasped in front of her like she was holding something invisible. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the girl spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're her." Elizabeth blinked. "I'm sorry. You're the one." "The one what?" The girl didn't answer. She just kept staring, and there was something unsettling about the intensity of her gaze, like she was looking for something specific and had just found it. Elizabeth stood up slowly, trying to keep her movements calm and unthreatening. "You must be Emma." The girl nodded. "I'm Elizabeth. I'm going to be working here now." Emma's expression didn't change. "I know." "Your father told you?" "No." Emma stepped into the room, her small feet silent on the floorboards. She moved closer, and Elizabeth resisted the urge to step back. There was nothing threatening about the child. She was tiny, delicate, like a doll, but there was something in her eyes that made Elizabeth's skin prickle. "How did you know then?" Elizabeth asked carefully. Emma tilted her head to one side, studying her. "I've been waiting for you." "Waiting for me?" "Yes." "Why?" The girl didn't answer. She just smiled, a strange, secretive smile that didn't reach her eyes, and turned to leave. "Wait!" Elizabeth called after her, but Emma was already gone, disappearing down the hallway like a ghost. Elizabeth stood alone in the small room, her heart beating faster than it should have been, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. "I've been waiting for you. What did that mean?" She pushed the thought aside and forced herself to focus. She was here to work, not to solve mysteries or worry about strange children. Tomorrow she'd start earning her keep. Tonight, she just needed to rest. But as she lay in bed later that evening, staring up at the ceiling in the dark, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not dangerous exactly, just off. Like she'd walked into the middle of a story that had already started, and everyone knew the plot except her. Downstairs, she could hear the faint creak of floorboards. Jacob moving through the house, probably. Or maybe Emma. Elizabeth closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but the girl's words kept echoing in her mind. "You're the one." Bam. The next morning, Elizabeth woke before dawn out of habit. The house was silent, and for a moment she lay still and listened to the emptiness around her. Then she got up, dressed quickly, and made her way downstairs. The kitchen was bigger than she'd expected, with a long wooden table in the center and a cast-iron stove against one wall. The shelves were half empty, stocked with mismatched dishes and jars of preserves that looked like they'd been there for years. A pump stood by the sink, and when Elizabeth tested it, the water came out cold and clear. She set to work. Breakfast was simple. Biscuits, bacon, and eggs, cooked in the skillet she found hanging on a hook. She worked quickly, efficiently, her hands moving through the familiar motions without thought. Cooking had always been the one thing she was good at, the one skill that never failed her. It didn't matter if she was making a meal for 20 people or just 2. The process was the same. Measure, mix, cook, serve. By the time the sun came up, she had the food ready and the table set. Jacob appeared first, walking into the kitchen without a word. He glanced at the table, then at her, and gave a single nod before sitting down. "Coffee?" Elizabeth asked. "Yeah." She poured him a cup and set it in front of him. He drank it black, no sugar, and ate his breakfast in silence. Elizabeth stood by the stove, waiting, unsure if she was supposed to sit or keep working. Eventually, she decided to clean up while he ate. Emma came down a few minutes later, moving so quietly that Elizabeth didn't notice her until she was already seated at the table. The girl picked at her food, pushing the eggs around her plate with a fork, and didn't say a word. Jacob finished his meal, stood up, and grabbed his hat from a hook by the door. "Good," he said, looking at Elizabeth. "Keep it up." Then he was gone. Elizabeth let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding and turned to clear the table. Emma was still sitting there, watching her with those wide, serious eyes. "Are you finished?" Elizabeth asked gently. Emma nodded, but didn't move. "Would you like me to take your plate?" Another nod. Elizabeth reached for the plate, and Emma's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. The girl's grip was surprisingly strong, her fingers cold. "You won't leave," Emma said quietly. Elizabeth froze. "What?" "You won't leave," the girl repeated, her voice firm. "Not like the others." I don't plan to." Emma studied her for a long moment, then released her wrist and slid off her chair. She walked to the doorway, paused, and looked back. "Good," she said, "because I chose you." And then she was gone again, leaving Elizabeth alone in the kitchen with a plate of half-eaten eggs and a growing sense that she'd just stepped into something far more complicated than a simple cook's position. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, though it was a strange, uneven sort of rhythm that never quite felt natural. Elizabeth woke early, cooked, cleaned, and tried to make sense of a household that seemed determined to remain a mystery. Jacob barely spoke to her. He came in for meals, ate in silence, and left. Sometimes he'd grunt in acknowledgement when the food was particularly good. Other times he didn't even look up from his plate. He worked from dawn until well past dark, fixing fences, tending cattle, doing all the hard labor of running a ranch by himself. Elizabeth watched him from the kitchen window sometimes, saw the way he moved, methodical, relentless, like he was trying to outrun something that couldn't be outrun. Grief, she thought. That's what the clerk had said. Jacob Calhoun lost his wife 2 years ago. Elizabeth understood grief. She'd lost people too. Her parents when she was young, the woman who'd taken her in and taught her to cook, friends who'd drifted away or died. Grief was just another weight you carried, and you either learned to live with it or it crushed you. Jacob, she suspected, was somewhere in between. Emma, on the other hand, was a different kind of puzzle. The girl followed her everywhere. Not obviously, she didn't cling or ask for attention, but Elizabeth would turn around and find her there, sitting in a corner or standing in a doorway, always watching. It should have been unsettling, and in some ways it was, but there was also something oddly comforting about it. Like the child had decided Elizabeth belonged here and was making sure she didn't disappear. One afternoon, Elizabeth was kneading bread dough when Emma appeared at her elbow. "Can I help?" the girl asked. Elizabeth glanced down at her, surprised. It was the first time Emma had asked for anything. "Sure," she said. "Wash your hands first." Emma did, scrubbing her small hands under the pump with the kind of focus most children reserved for play. Then she climbed onto a stool and watched as Elizabeth shaped the dough. "You press it like this," Elizabeth explained, demonstrating. "Fold it, push it, turn it. It's got to be smooth." Emma reached out tentatively and mimicked the motion. Her hands were too small to be very effective, but she tried, her face scrunched up in concentration. "Good," Elizabeth said. "Keep going." They worked in silence for a while, and Elizabeth found herself relaxing. There was something soothing about the repetitive motion, the warmth of the kitchen, the smell of yeast and flour. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt like she was doing something right. "Do you like it here?" Emma asked suddenly. Elizabeth hesitated. "It's different." "Different how?" "Quieter. Lonelier." "Are you lonely?" The question caught her off guard. Elizabeth stopped kneading and looked at the girl. Emma was watching her with that same intense gaze, waiting for an answer. "Sometimes," Elizabeth admitted. "Me too." The simple honesty of it made Elizabeth's chest tighten. She reached out and brushed a stray bit of flour from Emma's cheek. "Well," she said quietly, "maybe we can be less lonely together." Emma smiled then, a real smile, not the strange, secretive one from before, and it transformed her whole face. She looked like a normal little girl, happy and unburdened, and Elizabeth felt something shift inside her. A softening. A connection.
Maybe this place wasn't so bad after all.
That night, after supper, Elizabeth was washing dishes when Jacob came back into the kitchen. She glanced at him, expecting him to leave again, but he stood there, awkward and uncertain. "You settling in all right?" he asked. It was the first personal question he'd asked her since she'd arrived. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "Thank you." He nodded. "Emma likes you." "She's a good kid." "She is." Jacob paused, and for a moment, Elizabeth thought he was going to say something else, but then he just turned and walked out. Elizabeth finished the dishes and went upstairs. As she passed Emma's room, she heard the girl's voice, soft and sing-song, like she was talking to someone. She paused outside the door and listened. "I told you she'd come," Emma was saying. "I told you she was the right one. She's nice, and she makes Papa smile. Not a lot, but a little. That's good, isn't it?" There was a pause, and then Emma spoke again. "I know, I miss you too. But she's here now, and she's going to stay. I'll make sure of it." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. Who was Emma talking to? She pushed the door open slowly and looked inside. Emma was sitting on her bed, her back to the door, and in her hands was a small wooden box. She was cradling it like it was precious. "Emma?" Elizabeth said quietly. The girl turned, startled, and quickly hid the box behind her back. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop," Elizabeth said. "I just wanted to check on you." "I'm fine." "Who were you talking to?" Emma's face went carefully blank. "No one." "Emma, I said no one." The sharpness in her voice was surprising, and Elizabeth backed off. "All right, good night." She closed the door and stood in the hallway, her mind racing. "I told you she'd come. I told you she was the right one." Who had Emma been talking to, and what did she mean by the right one? Elizabeth went to bed that night with more questions than answers, and somewhere deep in the house she could have sworn she heard the faint sound of a woman's voice, humming a lullaby. Elizabeth didn't sleep well that night. She lay awake listening to the house settle around her, the creaks and groans of old wood, the whisper of wind against the windows. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, and more than once she thought she heard footsteps in the hallway, soft and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. But when she finally worked up the courage to open her door and look, there was nothing, just shadows and silence. By the time dawn broke, she was exhausted and irritable. She dressed quickly and went downstairs, determined to focus on work and nothing else. The kitchen was cold, the stove unlit, and she set about building a fire with more force than necessary, jamming kindling into the firebox like it had personally offended her. She was pulling a skillet from the shelf when Emma appeared in the doorway, already dressed, her hair neatly braided. "You're up early," Elizabeth said, trying to sound normal. "I always wake up early." "Can't sleep?" Emma shrugged. "Sometimes I dream too much." Elizabeth wanted to ask what she dreamed about, but something in the girl's expression stopped her. Instead, she turned back to the stove and started cracking eggs into a bowl. "Do you want to help again?" she asked. "No, I want to show you something." Elizabeth paused. "Show me what?" "Come with me." The girl turned and walked out of the kitchen, and after a moment's hesitation, Elizabeth followed. They went through the front room and up the stairs, Emma's small feet making no sound on the steps. At the end of the hallway, there was a door Elizabeth hadn't paid much attention to before. It was closed, and there was something about it that felt deliberate, like it was meant to be ignored. Emma stopped in front of it and looked up at Elizabeth. "This was her room," she said quietly. "Whose room?" "My mother's." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. "Emma, I don't think—" "It's okay. Papa doesn't come in here anymore, but I do. Sometimes." Emma reached for the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dim, the curtains drawn, but enough light filtered through to reveal a space that had been frozen in time. A large bed with a patchwork quilt, a wardrobe against one wall, a small writing desk near the window, its surface covered with a thin layer of dust. Everything was neat, orderly, like the woman who'd lived here had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any second. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, unsure whether to enter or retreat. "She liked this room," Emma said, walking inside. "She said it was the only place in the house where she could think." "Emma, we shouldn't be in here." "Why not?" "Because it's private." "It's not private if I bring you here." Emma went to the writing desk and opened one of the drawers. She pulled out a small wooden box, the same one Elizabeth had seen her holding the night before, and set it on the desk. She left things, for me, and for Papa. What kind of things? Letters. Elizabeth's curiosity got the better of her. She stepped into the room, moving carefully, like she was trespassing on sacred ground. Letters? Emma opened the box and pulled out a stack of envelopes, all tied together with a faded ribbon. She wrote them before she died. She knew she was going to die, so she wrote down everything she wanted to say. But she didn't give them to Papa. She gave them to me. Why? Because she said I'd know when to read them, and who to share them with. Emma held out the stack to Elizabeth. She wrote about you. Elizabeth's breath caught. That's not possible. She didn't know me. She knew someone like you would come. She wrote it down. Emma untied the ribbon and pulled out one of the envelopes. The handwriting on the front was elegant and precise. It read, "For the woman who comes after me." Elizabeth stared at it, her heart pounding. I can't read that. Why not? Because it's not meant for me. It is. That's why I chose you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and strange. Elizabeth wanted to argue, to tell the girl she was wrong, but something in Emma's eyes stopped her. The certainty there was unshakable. Please, Emma said quietly, just read it. Elizabeth took the envelope with trembling hands. She opened it carefully, pulled out the folded paper inside, and began to read. To the woman who comes after me. If you're reading this, it means my daughter has decided you're the one. I don't know your name or where you came from, but I know you're here, and that's enough. Emma is a strange child, brilliant and stubborn, and far too perceptive for her own good. She sees things other people miss. She feels things other people ignore. And she's been planning this since the day I told her I was dying. I tried to tell her it was wrong, that you can't choose a mother the way you choose a dress or a piece of fruit at the market. But she wouldn't listen. She said she'd know the right person when she saw them. She said she'd feel it. I don't know if that's true, but I hope it is. Because my husband, Jacob, he's a good man, but he's drowning. He won't admit it, but he is. And Emma needs someone who can pull him back to the surface, someone who can make this house feel like a home again. I'm asking you to do something impossible. I'm asking you to love them. Not because you have to, but because you choose to. I'm asking you to be patient with Jacob because he doesn't know how to let people in anymore. And I'm asking you to protect Emma because she's going to need someone who understands her. If you can do that, if you're willing to try, then maybe this family has a chance. With gratitude and hope, Catherine Calhoun. Elizabeth's hands were shaking by the time she finished reading. She looked up at Emma, who was watching her with that same intense, unblinking gaze. She wrote this before she died, Elizabeth said, her voice barely steady. Yes. And you've been planning this? Choosing someone? Emma nodded. The other cooks weren't right. They were mean, or they didn't care, or they only wanted the money. But you're different. I knew it the moment I saw you. Elizabeth sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, the letter still clutched in her hands. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she'd just learned. A dying woman had written instructions for her daughter to find a replacement, and a 6-year-old child had taken those instructions and turned them into a mission. It was insane. It was heartbreaking. And it was also, in some strange way, touching. Does your father know about this? Elizabeth asked. Emma shook her head. No, he'd be angry if he knew. He doesn't like talking about Mama. But you think he needs someone. I know he does. He's lonely and sad, and he works too much because he doesn't want to think about her. Emma sat down next to Elizabeth, her small body pressed against her side. But you make him smile. Just a little. I've seen it. Elizabeth wanted to argue, to tell the girl she was imagining things, but she couldn't. Because the truth was, she had noticed Jacob softening. Not much, just a little. A nod of approval when the food was good, a brief glance when he thought she wasn't looking. Small things, but they were there. Emma, Elizabeth said carefully, you can't force people to care about each other. It doesn't work that way. I'm not forcing anything. I'm just helping. Helping how? Emma smiled, that secretive smile that made Elizabeth's skin prickle. You'll see. Before Elizabeth could respond, they heard the front door open downstairs. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor, and Jacob's voice called out, "Emma, where are you?" The girl jumped up and ran to the door. "Coming, Papa." She disappeared down the hallway, leaving Elizabeth alone in the dead woman's room with a letter that felt like it was burning a hole in her hands. Elizabeth folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. She set it on the desk, looked around the room one last time, and walked out. She closed the door behind her and stood in the hallway for a moment, trying to steady herself. This was wrong, all of it. She shouldn't be here. She shouldn't be part of whatever plan Emma had concocted in her grief-stricken mind. She should pack her bag, walk back to Dodge City, and find work somewhere normal. Somewhere that didn't involve dead women's letters and children playing matchmaker. But even as she thought it, she knew she wouldn't leave. Because the truth was, she didn't have anywhere else to go. And maybe, just maybe, she wanted to stay. The days after that were strange. Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not just by Emma, but by the house itself. She'd be cooking or cleaning, and she'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. But when she turned, there was nothing there. Doors that she'd left open would be closed. Objects would move from one place to another, small things, like a spoon or a dish towel, but enough to make her notice. She told herself it was her imagination, that she was tired and stressed and seeing things that weren't there. But then, one afternoon, she found the photographs. She'd been dusting the front room when she noticed a box tucked under one of the side tables. It was small and wooden, plain and unadorned, and when she pulled it out, she found it was full of old photographs. She sat down on the floor and started going through them, curiosity getting the better of her. Most of them were family portraits. Jacob and a woman who must have been Catherine, standing stiffly in front of the camera. Emma as a baby, wrapped in a blanket. The three of them together, posed on the porch of the ranch house. Catherine had been beautiful. Not in the delicate porcelain doll way that people wrote about in books, but in a strong, capable way. She had dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that looked like they didn't miss anything. In every photograph, she was smiling. Not a big, showy smile, but a small, genuine one that made her look content. Elizabeth stared at one of the photographs for a long time. It was Catherine standing alone in the kitchen, an apron tied around her waist, her hands covered in flour. She looked happy, at home, like she belonged. Elizabeth felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name, envy, maybe, or sadness, or both. That was her favorite picture. Elizabeth jumped and turned. Jacob was standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking at the photograph over her shoulder. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said quickly, setting the photograph down. "I didn't mean to pry." "You weren't." Jacob walked into the room and sat down in one of the chairs. He looked tired, more tired than usual, and there was something in his expression that made Elizabeth's chest ache. "Emma must have pulled that box out. She does that sometimes. She misses her." "Yeah." Jacob was quiet for a moment, staring at nothing. "She was a good woman, Catherine. Strong, smart, didn't take any nonsense from anyone, including me." Elizabeth didn't know what to say, so she stayed quiet. "She got sick 2 years ago," Jacob continued, his voice low. "Started out as a cough, then it got worse. By the time we got a doctor out here, it was too late. Pneumonia. She lasted 3 months. He paused. Emma doesn't talk about it much, but she remembers everything. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said softly. Jacob looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something other than distance in his eyes. Vulnerability, pain, the kind of raw emotion that people usually kept hidden. "You're doing a good job," he said quietly, "with the house, with Emma. I appreciate it. Thank you." He stood up and put his hat back on. "Don't let the past bother you too much. It's just a house. And dead folks, they don't come back." But as he walked out, Elizabeth couldn't help but think he was wrong, because something in this house was very much alive. That night, Elizabeth was lying in bed when she heard it again. The humming. Soft and low, coming from somewhere downstairs. She sat up, her heart pounding, and listened. It was the same melody she'd heard before. A lullaby, slow and sad, like something a mother would sing to a child who couldn't sleep. Elizabeth got out of bed and crept to the door. She opened it slowly and looked down the hallway. Everything was dark and still. The humming continued. She took a breath and made her way downstairs, moving as quietly as she could. The front room was empty. The kitchen was dark, but the humming was coming from somewhere close. Elizabeth followed the sound to the door of Catherine's room. It was open. She stepped inside, her pulse racing, and saw Emma sitting on the floor in her nightgown, the wooden box open in front of her. The girl was humming to herself, rocking back and forth slightly, her eyes closed. "Emma," Elizabeth whispered. The girl's eyes opened, and she looked up. "She's here," she said simply. "Who's here?" "Mama. She comes sometimes, to check on me." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "Emma, your mother is dead." "I know." Emma stood up and walked over to Elizabeth. "But she still comes. She wants to make sure I'm okay, and she wanted to meet you." "That's not possible." "It is. She told me." Emma took Elizabeth's hand, her small fingers surprisingly warm. "She likes you. She said you're kind and brave, and that Papa needs someone like you." Elizabeth pulled her hand away, her breath coming faster. "Emma, you're scaring me." "Don't be scared. She's not here to hurt anyone. She just wants us to be happy." "This isn't real." "It is." Emma's voice was calm, certain. "You'll see." Elizabeth turned and walked out of the room, her hands shaking. She went back upstairs, locked her door, and sat on the edge of her bed, trying to convince herself that she'd imagined the whole thing. But she hadn't, and deep down, she knew it. The next morning, Elizabeth was determined to act like nothing had happened. She cooked breakfast, cleaned the kitchen, and avoided looking at Emma more than necessary. Jacob came in, ate in silence, and left. The routine was the same as always, but everything felt different. Elizabeth was scrubbing the floor when Emma appeared beside her, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "I picked these for you," the girl said. Elizabeth looked at the flowers, bright yellows and purples, tied together with a piece of string, and felt her resolve weaken. "Thank you. They're beautiful." "Mama used to pick flowers like this. She said they made the house smell nice." Elizabeth took the bouquet and set it in a jar of water on the windowsill. The flowers did make the house smell nice, fresh and alive. "Emma," she said carefully, "about last night. I know you don't believe me. That's okay. You will eventually." "Believe what?" "That she's still here, that she's watching over us." Emma smiled. "You're part of the family now. She made sure of it." Elizabeth wanted to argue, but the girl was already gone, skipping out of the kitchen like she hadn't just said something completely unsettling. Elizabeth spent the rest of the day trying to distract herself with work. She washed clothes, mended a tear in one of Jacob's shirts, and baked bread. But no matter how busy she kept herself, she couldn't stop thinking about Catherine's letter. "I'm asking you to love them." It was an impossible request. You couldn't just decide to love someone. Love wasn't something you controlled or planned. It happened or it didn't. But then again, Elizabeth had already started to care. About Emma, certainly. The girl was strange and unsettling, but she was also lonely and desperate for connection. And Jacob was harder to read. But there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when she saw past the walls he'd built around himself. Moments when he looked at her and she thought maybe, just maybe, he saw her too. That evening, after supper, Jacob lingered in the kitchen longer than usual. He stood by the window, looking out at the darkening sky, and Elizabeth worked quietly at the sink, washing dishes. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked suddenly. Elizabeth paused. "Leaving?" "The ranch, going back to the city, or somewhere else?" "Sometimes." "Why don't you?" She considered the question. "Because I don't have anywhere else to go." Jacob turned to look at her. "That's not a good reason to stay." "Maybe not, but it's the truth." He was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." "What about you?" Elizabeth asked. "Do you ever think about leaving?" "No, this place is all I've got. And Emma, she needs stability. Can't just uproot her because I'm tired of fixing fences." "You love her a lot." "She's my daughter." "That doesn't always mean the same thing." Jacob's jaw tightened. "It does to me." Elizabeth turned back to the dishes, regretting the comment. She hadn't meant to pry. But Jacob didn't leave. He stayed by the window, and after a while, he spoke again. "Catherine used to say I worked too much. that I needed to slow down, enjoy things. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. I didn't listen. And then she was gone, and all I had left was the work. I'm sorry. Don't be. It's not your fault. He looked at her again, and this time there was something different in his eyes. Something softer. You remind me of her sometimes. The way you move around the kitchen, the way you talk to Emma. It's familiar. Elizabeth didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Jacob pushed away from the window and grabbed his hat. Good night, Elizabeth. Good night. He left, and Elizabeth stood alone in the kitchen, her hands still wet from the dishwater, her heart beating just a little too fast. She reminded him of Catherine. She didn't know if that was a compliment or a curse. The next few weeks passed in a blur of routine and small revelations. Elizabeth found herself settling into the rhythm of the ranch in ways she hadn't expected. She learned which floorboards creaked, which cupboard doors stuck, how to coax the temperamental stove into heating evenly. She learned that Jacob took his coffee strong enough to strip paint, that Emma hated carrots but would eat them if they were hidden in stew, that the pump handle needed to be jiggled just right or it would spray water everywhere. She also learned that the house had moods. Some mornings it felt light and welcoming, the sun streaming through the windows in warm golden bands. Other days it felt heavy, oppressive, like something was pressing down on the roof. Elizabeth told herself it was just weather, just her imagination, but she couldn't quite convince herself that was true. Emma's behavior didn't help. The girl had become even more attached to her, following her from room to room, asking questions, offering to help with tasks she was too small to actually accomplish. But there was an intensity to it that made Elizabeth uneasy. Emma watched her constantly, studying her reactions, testing her responses, like she was measuring Elizabeth against some invisible standard. One afternoon, Elizabeth was folding laundry when Emma appeared with a book in her hands. "Will you read to me?" the girl asked. Elizabeth looked at the book, a collection of fairy tales, the cover worn and faded. "Where'd you get that?" "It was Mama's. She used to read it to me every night." Elizabeth hesitated. "Maybe you should ask your father to read it." "He won't. He doesn't like books anymore." Emma held it out insistently. "Please?" Elizabeth took the book and sat down in one of the chairs by the window. Emma climbed into her lap without asking, settling against her chest like it was the most natural thing in the world. Elizabeth opened the book and started reading, her voice steady despite the tightness in her throat. The story was about a princess locked in a tower, waiting for someone to rescue her. It was the kind of tale Elizabeth had heard a dozen times before, predictable and safe. But as she read, she became aware of Emma's breathing, slow and even, and the weight of the child against her, small and trusting. When she finished, Emma looked up at her with those serious blue eyes. "Mama said stories are important because they teach you how to hope." Elizabeth closed the book carefully. "That's a nice thought. Do you hope for things?" "Sometimes." "What do you hope for?" Elizabeth didn't know how to answer that. What did she hope for? A place to belong? People who cared whether she lived or died? A future that didn't involve scraping by and wondering when the next disaster would strike? "I hope you grow up happy," she said finally. Emma smiled. "I will, because you're here now." The certainty in her voice was both touching and terrifying. That evening, Elizabeth was putting away dishes when Jacob came into the kitchen carrying a dead chicken. He dropped it on the counter with a thud. "Found it in the yard," he said. "Fox got to it, or maybe a coyote." Elizabeth looked at the mangled bird and felt her stomach turn. "I'll clean it up." "You know how to dress a chicken?" "I've done it before." Jacob nodded and started to leave, then paused. "Emma was laughing earlier. I heard her from the barn. She asked me to read to her." "She asked you to read often?" "A few times." Jacob looked like he wanted to say something else, but instead he just nodded again and walked out. Elizabeth stood there for a moment, holding a dish towel and trying to figure out what had just happened. Was he grateful, suspicious, jealous? She couldn't tell. She cleaned the chicken, plucked the feathers, and prepared it for tomorrow's supper. The work was messy and unpleasant, but it gave her something to focus on besides the growing knot of confusion in her chest. Later that night, she went upstairs and found Emma's door slightly ajar. She knocked softly. "Come in," Emma called. Elizabeth pushed the door open and found the girl sitting on her bed, the wooden box open beside her. More letters were spread out on the quilt, and Emma was reading one by candlelight. "You shouldn't be reading in the dark," Elizabeth said. "You'll hurt your eyes." "I can see fine." Elizabeth sat down on the edge of the bed. "What are you reading?" "Another letter from Mama. This one's about Papa." "Emma, she says he's scared, that he doesn't know how to be close to people anymore because it hurts too much when they leave." Emma looked up. "But she says the right person can fix that. Someone patient. Someone who won't give up on him." Elizabeth felt her face grow warm. "I'm not trying to fix anyone." "I know, but you are anyway." Emma folded the letter carefully. "Papa likes you. He just doesn't know how to show it." "How do you know that?" "Because he smiles when you're not looking, and he talks about you to the horses." Elizabeth blinked. "He what?" "When he's in the barn, he talks to the horses about things, and lately he talks about you. He said you make good biscuits, and that you're tougher than you look." Elizabeth didn't know whether to be flattered or mortified. "You shouldn't eavesdrop." "I wasn't eavesdropping. I was just there." Emma put the letter back in the box. "Do you like him?" "He's my employer." "That's not what I asked." Elizabeth stood up, suddenly desperate to escape this conversation. "It's late. You should sleep." "You didn't answer." "Good night, Emma." She left before the girl could press further, closing the door behind her and leaning against it for a moment. Her heart was racing, and she felt foolish for letting a child get under her skin. Did she like Jacob? She didn't know. He was hard to read, closed off, and he barely spoke to her most days. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when she caught him looking at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Curiosity, maybe, or loneliness, or something else entirely. It didn't matter. She was here to work, not to entertain fantasies about a widowed rancher who was still grieving his dead wife. But as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about what Emma had said. The right person can fix that. Elizabeth didn't want to fix anyone. She could barely keep herself together. The following Sunday was her day off, and Elizabeth decided to spend it walking. She needed to get out of the house, away from Emma's knowing looks and Jacob's brooding silences. The weather was clear and cool, and she followed the dirt road that led away from the ranch, letting her feet carry her without any particular destination in mind. She'd been walking for about an hour when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She turned and saw Jacob riding up on a dark bay horse, his hat pulled low against the sun. He reined in beside her. "Where you headed?" "Nowhere." "Just walking?" "It's 5 miles to town from here." "I'm not going to town." Jacob looked at her for a moment, then dismounted. "I'll walk with you." Elizabeth wanted to protest, but he was already leading his horse beside her, and it would have been rude to refuse. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of their boots on the dirt and the occasional snort from the horse. "You don't have to babysit me," Elizabeth said eventually. "I'm not. Just felt like walking." "On your day off?" "I don't really take days off." "Maybe you should." Jacob glanced at her. "You sound like Catherine." There it was again. That name. Elizabeth was starting to hate how often it came up, like a ghost that wouldn't stop haunting the conversation. "I'm not trying to sound like anyone," she said, more sharply than she intended. "Didn't say you were." Jacob was quiet for a moment, then added, "She used to tell me I worked too hard, that I needed to rest. I didn't listen. Do you regret that?" "Every day." The honesty in his voice surprised her. Elizabeth looked at him, and for the first time, she saw past the hard exterior to the man underneath. He looked tired, not just physically, but in a deeper way. Like he'd been carrying something heavy for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. "You're doing the best you can," Elizabeth said quietly. "Am I? Because most days it doesn't feel like enough. You're raising a daughter by yourself, running a ranch by yourself. That's not nothing." Jacob stopped walking and turned to face her. "You think I'm doing a good job?" "I think you're trying. That counts for something." He studied her, and Elizabeth felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or surprise, or something else entirely. "You're different from the others," he said finally. "The other cooks?" "Yeah, they didn't last because they didn't care. They saw it as just a job, but you—" He trailed off,
looking like he wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. But I what? You care. About the house. About Emma. Even about me, I think. Elizabeth's face grew warm. I'm just doing my job. No, you're doing more than that. Jacob picked up the reins and started walking again. And I appreciate it.
They walked in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence. Comfortable. Almost easy. Elizabeth found herself relaxing, letting her guard down just a little. When they finally turned back toward the ranch, the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely way, and Elizabeth felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Maybe this place was starting to feel like home. The next morning, everything changed. Elizabeth was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. She looked out the window and saw a well-dressed woman climbing down from the driver's seat, smoothing her skirts and adjusting her hat. She was probably in her early 30s, with auburn hair and a face that was handsome rather than pretty. Jacob came out of the barn to greet her, and Elizabeth watched as they spoke. The woman smiled broadly, touching Jacob's arm in a familiar way that made Elizabeth's stomach tighten. Emma appeared at her elbow. "That's Mrs. Brennan," she said, her voice flat. "Who's Mrs. Brennan?" "She owns the general store in town, and she wants to marry Papa." Elizabeth turned to look at the girl. "How do you know that?" "Because she told me. Last time she was here, she said she'd make a much better mother than some stranger." Emma's expression darkened. "I don't like her." "Emma, that's not a nice thing to say." "I don't care. She's mean. She pretends to be nice, but she's not. She only wants Papa because of the ranch." Elizabeth looked back out the window. Mrs. Brennan was still talking to Jacob, gesturing toward the house. Then she started walking toward the front door, and Elizabeth barely had time to step away from the window before there was a knock. She opened the door to find Mrs. Brennan standing there with a basket in her hands and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be the new cook," the woman said. "I'm Evelyn Brennan." "Elizabeth Hartley. Pleased to meet you." Evelyn walked past her into the house without waiting for an invitation. "I brought some preserves for Jacob and some fabric for Emma. Growing girl needs new dresses, don't you think?" "That's very kind of you." Evelyn set the basket on the table and looked around the kitchen with an appraising eye. "My, you've certainly cleaned the place up. It was an absolute mess the last time I was here. The previous cook had no sense of order." Elizabeth didn't respond. She just watched as Evelyn moved through the kitchen like she owned it, opening cupboards, checking the stove, examining the dishes. "You know," Evelyn said, turning to face her, "Jacob really needs someone permanent, someone who can provide stability for Emma. A child that age needs a mother, not just a hired hand." "I'm aware. Are you?" Evelyn's smile sharpened. "Because from what I hear, you're the 5th cook he's hired in 2 years. The others didn't last. What makes you think you will?" Elizabeth felt her temper flare but kept her voice level. "I'm not planning to leave." "Plans change." Evelyn picked up the basket. "I'll just take this to Jacob myself. It was nice meeting you, Miss Hartley." She walked out, and Elizabeth stood alone in the kitchen, her hands clenched into fists. She heard voices outside, Evelyn's bright and cheerful, Jacob's low and polite, and then the sound of the wagon pulling away. Emma appeared in the doorway. "I told you she was mean." "She wasn't mean, just direct. She wants you gone, so she can take your place." Elizabeth knelt down to Emma's level. "Listen to me. Your father can make his own decisions about who he spends time with. It's not our business. But you're better than her." "That's not for me to say." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "You're not going to fight for us?" The question hit Elizabeth like a punch to the chest. "Emma, Mama said the right person would fight, that they wouldn't just give up." "I'm not giving up. I'm just being realistic." "That's the same thing." Emma turned and ran out of the kitchen, her footsteps echoing through the house. Elizabeth heard the front door slam and then silence. She stood there for a moment, feeling like she'd just failed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. That evening, Jacob came in for supper looking uncomfortable. He sat down at the table, and Elizabeth set a plate in front of him without a word. "Evelyn stopped by," he said. "I know. I met her. She's persistent. She seems nice." Jacob looked up at her. "You think so?" Elizabeth shrugged. She brought you preserves and fabric for Emma. That's thoughtful. She wants something. Don't most people? Jacob set down his fork. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. I'm just saying people don't usually do things without a reason. You think she's trying to manipulate me? I think she's interested in you, and there's nothing wrong with that. Jacob stared at her, and Elizabeth couldn't read his expression. Then he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. I'm not interested in her, he said quietly. That's your business. Is it? He took a step closer. Because it seems like you've got opinions about it. I don't. You're lying. Elizabeth's temper snapped. Fine. You want my opinion? I think Mrs. Brennan is exactly what you need. Someone respectable. Someone established. Someone who can give Emma a proper home. And I think you should seriously consider her offer before you end up alone in this house with nothing but your grief and your stubbornness for company. The words came out harsher than she'd intended, and the moment they left her mouth, she regretted them. Jacob's expression hardened, his jaw clenching. You don't know anything about me, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I know enough. No, you don't. He grabbed his hat and walked to the door. Emma's upstairs. Make sure she eats something. Then he was gone, slamming the door behind him. Elizabeth stood alone in the kitchen, shaking. She pressed her hands against the counter and took a deep breath, trying to calm down. What had she just done? She'd pushed him away. That's what she'd done. She'd taken her fear and her insecurity and her stupid, irrational jealousy and thrown it at him like a weapon. She heard footsteps on the stairs and turned to see Emma standing in the doorway, her face pale. You made him angry, the girl said. I know. Are you going to apologize? I don't know. Emma walked over and took her hand. Mama said fights are only bad if you don't fix them. You have to fix this. How? Tell him the truth. Tell him you don't want him to marry Mrs. Brennan. Elizabeth pulled her hand away. I can't do that. Why not? Because it's not my place. Yes, it is. You're part of this family now, whether you like it or not. Emma's voice was fierce, almost angry. And families fight for each other. That's what Mama said. That's what she wanted. Elizabeth looked at the girl, at the determination in her eyes, and felt something crack inside her. Because Emma was right. She did care. More than she wanted to admit, more than was safe. She cared about this strange, haunted house. She cared about this intense, brilliant child. And she cared about Jacob, with his walls and his grief and his stubborn refusal to let anyone in. But caring wasn't enough. It never was. I'll talk to him, Elizabeth said quietly, but I can't promise it will change anything. Emma nodded, satisfied. That's all I'm asking. Elizabeth waited until after Emma went to bed, then walked out to the barn. The door was open, and she could see Jacob inside, working on a broken harness by lamplight. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, trying to figure out what to say. He looked up and saw her. What do you want? To apologize. For what? For what I said earlier. It was out of line. Jacob set down the harness. Was it true? Some of it. Which part? Elizabeth stepped into the barn. The part about you deserving someone respectable, someone who can give Emma stability. That's true. And the rest? The rest was me being scared. Jacob frowned. Scared of what? Of this. Of caring too much. Of getting attached to a place I might have to leave. She took a breath. I don't have a good track record with staying in one place. Things always fall apart. And I thought if I could convince myself you'd be better off with someone like Mrs. Brennan, it would hurt less when I had to go. Jacob stood up and walked toward her. Who said you have to go? Nobody. But that's how it always ends up. Not this time. You don't know that. Yes, I do. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his eyes. Because I'm asking you to stay. Elizabeth's breath caught. Jacob, I mean it. I don't want Evelyn Brennan. I don't want anyone from town. I want... He trailed off, looking frustrated. Hell, I don't know what I want, but I know it's not her. Then what is it? Maybe it's you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible. Elizabeth wanted to reach for him, to close the distance, but she was frozen. I'm not Catherine, she said quietly. I know. I can't replace her. I'm not asking you to. Jacob reached out and touched her cheek, his hand rough and warm. I'm asking you to be yourself. And to stay. Elizabeth closed her eyes, leaning into his touch despite every instinct telling her to run. This was dangerous. This was reckless. This was everything she'd spent years protecting herself against. But maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk. Elizabeth opened her eyes and looked at Jacob, really looked at him, and saw something in his face that made her chest tighten. Vulnerability, hope, the same desperate longing she'd been trying so hard to bury. I'll stay, she whispered. Jacob's hand dropped from her cheek, but he didn't step back. Instead, he stood there looking at her like he was trying to memorize her face, like he was afraid she might disappear if he blinked. You mean that? He asked. I think so, yes. You think so or you know so? Elizabeth felt a flicker of annoyance cut through the tension. I'm here, aren't I? I'm standing in your barn at 9 o'clock at night having this conversation instead of packing my bags. What more do you want? I want to know you're not going to run the first time things get hard. Things are already hard, Jacob. They've been hard since the day I got here. Then why stay? Because... She stopped, frustrated. Why was she staying? Because of Emma? Because she had nowhere else to go? Because of the way Jacob looked at her sometimes, like she was the answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask? All of it. None of it. She didn't know anymore. Because I want to, she said finally. Is that good enough? Jacob's expression softened, and for a moment she thought he might smile. But instead he just nodded and turned back to the harness on the workbench. Then we'll figure it out, he said quietly. Elizabeth waited for him to say something else, but he didn't. He just picked up his tools and went back to work, and she realized the conversation was over. She stood there feeling foolish and uncertain, then turned and walked back to the house. Emma was waiting for her in the kitchen, sitting at the table in her nightgown. You're supposed to be in bed, Elizabeth said. Did you fix it? I don't know. Maybe. Emma smiled, that secretive, knowing smile that always made Elizabeth feel like the girl could see straight through her. He likes you, more than he wants to admit. How do you know? Because he's scared, and people are only scared when they care about something. Emma slid off the chair and walked over to her. Mama said love is always scary. That's how you know it's real. Elizabeth knelt down so they were eye to eye. Your mama was a smart woman. I know, and she was right about you. What did she say about me? That you'd be brave enough to stay, even when it was hard. Elizabeth pulled Emma into a hug, holding her tight. The girl wrapped her arms around her neck and buried her face in her shoulder, and Elizabeth felt something inside her settle. This child needed her, not as a replacement for Catherine, but as herself. And maybe that was enough. Go to bed, she whispered. We'll talk more tomorrow. Emma nodded and pulled away, but before she left the kitchen, she turned back. I'm glad you came here. Even if you don't believe it yet, I am. Then she was gone, her small feet padding up the stairs. Elizabeth cleaned up the kitchen in a daze, her mind replaying the conversation in the barn over and over. Jacob wanted her to stay. He'd said maybe it was her. What did that mean? That he cared about her? That he wanted something more than just a cook and housekeeper? She didn't know. And the not knowing was terrifying. But she'd made her choice. She was staying, and whatever came next, she'd face it. The next few days were strange. Elizabeth and Jacob moved around each other carefully, like they were both afraid of breaking whatever fragile thing had formed between them. He started lingering at meals, asking her questions about her day, actually listening to her answers. She found herself watching him when he didn't know she was looking, noticing the way his shoulders relaxed when he came inside after a long day, the way his eyes softened when Emma laughed. Emma, for her part, seemed delighted by the shift in atmosphere. She started orchestrating small moments, asking Jacob to help Elizabeth carry something heavy, suggesting they all eat supper outside one evening, leaving the two of them alone in the kitchen while she conveniently disappeared to do chores. Your daughter is not subtle, Elizabeth said one afternoon while she was kneading bread and Jacob was fixing a broken chair leg. Never has been. Doesn't it bother you that she's trying to push us together? Jacob looked up from his work. Maybe it should, but honestly, I'm too tired to fight it. Elizabeth paused mid-need. So you're just going along with whatever a 6-year-old decides? She's got better instincts than I do. He set down the chair and walked over to the table.
And she's not wrong about everything. Like what? Like you being good for this family. Elizabeth's hand stilled in the dough. Jacob, I'm not good at this, he said, cutting her off. Talking, feelings, all of it. Catherine used to say I had the emotional range of a fence post. He ran a hand through his hair, looking uncomfortable. But I'm trying, and I need you to know that if I'm doing this wrong, it's not because I don't care, it's because I don't know how. Elizabeth wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face him. You're doing fine. Am I? Better than fine.
Jacob reached out and brushed a bit of flour from her cheek, and the touch sent a spark through her. They stood there for a moment, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him, and Elizabeth's heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. Then the front door banged open and Emma came running in, breathless and excited. Mrs. Brennan's wagon is coming up the road. Elizabeth and Jacob stepped apart quickly. Jacob's expression darkened. Again? She was just here 3 days ago. Maybe she forgot something, Elizabeth said, though her stomach was already nodding. She didn't forget anything. She's persistent, like I said. Emma tugged on Elizabeth's skirt. Don't let her take you away. Nobody's taking anyone away, Elizabeth said firmly, though she wasn't sure she believed it. They all walked to the front porch and watched as Evelyn Brennan's wagon pulled into the yard. The woman climbed down gracefully, her dress impeccable despite the dusty road, and smiled brightly at Jacob. Good afternoon. I hope I'm not intruding. What brings you out here, Evelyn? Jacob's tone was polite but cool. I wanted to check on Emma, see how she's getting along with the new cook. Evelyn's gaze slid to Elizabeth, and there was something calculating in her eyes. And I thought perhaps we could discuss that matter we talked about last time. What matter? The one about Emma's future, her education, her need for proper guidance. Evelyn walked up the porch steps, uninvited. A girl her age should be in school, Jacob, learning from other children, not isolated out here with just hired help for company. Elizabeth felt her face flush, but she kept her mouth shut. This wasn't her fight. Emma's doing fine, Jacob said. Is she? When was the last time she spent time with children her own age? When was the last time she had a woman's influence, a real woman's influence, I mean, teaching her how to behave properly? Jacob's jaw tightened. I think you should leave. I'm only trying to help, as a friend. Evelyn placed a hand on his arm. You can't do this alone, Jacob. You need support, a partner, someone who understands what Emma needs. I have what I need. Do you? Evelyn's eyes flicked to Elizabeth again. Because from where I'm standing, you've got a cook who won't last 6 months. They never do. And when she leaves, you'll be right back where you started. Emma stepped forward, her small face fierce. She's not leaving, and you're not welcome here. Emma! Jacob's voice was sharp, but Emma didn't back down. She stared at Evelyn with an intensity that made the woman take a step back. You don't care about me. You don't care about Papa. You just want the ranch, and I won't let you have it. Emma, apologize, Jacob said. No. Elizabeth knelt down beside the girl and put a hand on her shoulder. Emma, that's enough. But she's enough. Elizabeth's voice was firm but gentle. She looked up at Evelyn. I think it's best if you go, Mrs. Brennan. Evelyn's expression hardened. You have no authority here, Miss Hartley. You're just the help. Maybe, but I'm the help who's staying. Elizabeth stood up, keeping her hand on Emma's shoulder. And I think you've overstayed your welcome. For a moment, Evelyn looked like she might argue. Then she smoothed her skirts and turned to Jacob. You're making a mistake, she said coldly. Both of you. But don't come crying to me when it all falls apart. She climbed back into her wagon and drove away without another word. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Jacob stood on the porch, his arms crossed, staring after the retreating wagon. Emma was still trembling with anger, and Elizabeth felt her own heart racing. Emma, go inside, Jacob said quietly. But Papa, inside, now. Emma looked at Elizabeth, who nodded. The girl reluctantly went into the house, leaving Elizabeth and Jacob alone. Jacob turned to her, and his expression was unreadable. You shouldn't have spoken to her like that. Elizabeth felt a flash of anger. She insulted me. She insulted Emma. What was I supposed to do, stand there and take it? She's a prominent woman in town. You just made an enemy. I don't care. Well, you should. Jacob's voice rose slightly. Because if she decides to make trouble for us, she can. She's got connections, influence, and you just gave her a reason to use both.
Then maybe I should leave. Would that make things easier for you? That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? Jacob ran a hand over his face, looking exhausted. I'm saying this is complicated, and I don't know how to protect both of you from people like her. We don't need protection. We need you to stand up for us. I did stand up for you. No, you told Emma to apologize. You acted like she was the problem when Evelyn was the one who came here uninvited and started insulting your family. She's not... Jacob stopped himself. She's not what? Not family? Is that what you were going to say? No. Then what?
Jacob looked at her, and there was something raw in his expression. I was going to say she's not wrong. About everything. Emma should be in school. She should have friends. And she should have a mother, a real mother, not just someone I hired. The words hit Elizabeth like a slap. She took a step back, her throat tight. Right. Well, like I said, maybe I should go. She turned and walked into the house before he could respond. Emma was sitting on the stairs, her eyes red.
I heard, the girl said quietly. It's fine. No, it's not. He hurt your feelings. Elizabeth sat down beside her. He's just scared. And when people are scared, they say things they don't mean. Do you really think you should leave? I don't know. Emma grabbed her hand. Please don't go. Please. Emma, I need you. And Papa needs you too, even if he's too stupid to say it. Tears were streaming down the girl's face now. Mama said you'd stay. She promised.
Elizabeth pulled Emma into her arms, holding her while she cried. Her own eyes were burning, but she refused to let the tears fall. She had to be strong. For Emma, for herself. Because the truth was, she didn't want to leave. Despite everything, despite Jacob's walls and Evelyn's threats, and the ghost of Catherine that still haunted this house, she wanted to stay. But wanting something and being allowed to have it were two very different things. That night, Elizabeth lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She kept replaying the argument with Jacob in her mind, picking apart every word, every look, trying to figure out what he really meant. Around midnight, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Then a soft knock on her door. She got up and opened it to find Jacob standing there, still fully dressed, looking like he'd been wrestling with something all evening. Can we talk? He asked. Elizabeth wanted to say no. She wanted to slam the door in his face and prove she didn't need his approval or his permission to exist. But instead, she stepped aside and let him in. He stood awkwardly in the middle of her small room, his hat in his hands. I was wrong, he said. About what I said earlier. About Emma needing a real mother. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. How did you mean it? I meant she deserves someone who's committed. Someone who won't disappear. He looked at her. But I shouldn't have said it like that. Like you're not good enough, because you are. Elizabeth crossed her arms. Am I? Yes, you're... He struggled for words. You're everything she needs. Everything we need. And I'm terrified of that. Why? Because what if you leave? What if I let myself depend on you, and then you're gone and I have to pick up the pieces again? His voice cracked slightly. I barely survived losing Catherine. I can't do it again. Elizabeth felt her anger dissolve. She walked over to him and took his hand. I'm not Catherine, she said softly. And I'm not asking you to forget her, but I'm here, right now, and I'm not planning to go anywhere. How can you promise that? I can't. Nobody can promise forever, but I can promise today, and tomorrow, and the day after that. And maybe that's enough. Jacob looked down at their joined hands. I don't know how to do this. How to move on. How to let someone else in. You don't have to know. We'll figure it out together. He met her eyes, and Elizabeth saw the war happening inside him, fear and hope battling for dominance. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was tentative at first, uncertain, like he was afraid she might pull away. But Elizabeth didn't pull away. She kissed him back, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her palm. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. I'm still terrified, Jacob said. Me too. Good. At least we're even. Elizabeth laughed despite herself, and Jacob smiled. a real smile, not the tight, careful ones he usually wore. It transformed his whole face, made him look younger, less burdened. "Stay with me," he said quietly. "Not as the cook, as whatever this is." "I don't know what this is." "Neither do I, but I'd like to find out." Elizabeth nodded and Jacob kissed her again, deeper this time, less hesitant. She felt something inside her give way, some wall she'd built around herself crumbling. This was dangerous, this was reckless, but it was also real, and she was tired of running from real things. They stood there in her small room, holding each other, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Elizabeth felt like she might actually belong. The next morning, Elizabeth woke feeling lighter than she had in years. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Emma already in the kitchen, a suspicious smile on her face. "Good morning," the girl sang. "Good morning. You look happy." "Do I?" "Very happy. Did something happen?" Elizabeth felt her face grow warm. "None of your business," Emma giggled. "Papa's happy too. He was whistling in the barn." "Your father whistles?" "Not usually. Only when he's really happy." Emma climbed onto a stool. "So what happened?" "I told you, none of your business. But I helped make it happen. I should get to know." Elizabeth turned to look at her. "You helped?" "Of course. Who do you think kept leaving you two alone together? Who kept telling Papa how nice you are? Who's been orchestrating this whole thing from the beginning?" Elizabeth finished, shaking her head. "You're terrifying, you know that?" Emma beamed. "Mama said I get it from her." Before Elizabeth could respond, Jacob walked in through the back door. He stopped when he saw them, and for a moment there was an awkward silence. Then Emma hopped off her stool. "I'm going to go feed the chickens," she announced, even though she'd never voluntarily fed the chickens in her life. "Emma, you don't have to—" But the girl was already gone, the door swinging shut behind her. Jacob walked over to Elizabeth, and she saw the uncertainty in his eyes, like he wasn't sure if last night had been real or if he'd imagined it. "Morning," he said. "Morning. About last night—" "Don't," Elizabeth said quickly. "Don't apologize or tell me it was a mistake." "I wasn't going to. I was going to say I meant every word." Relief flooded through her. "Oh. And I want to do this right. Whatever this is, I want to do it right." Elizabeth set down the spoon she'd been holding. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm done pretending I don't care about you. It means I'm done letting fear run my life. And it means—" He took a breath. "It means I want you to stay, not as the cook, as part of this family, if you'll have us." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. "Are you sure?" "No, but I'm willing to try anyway." She laughed and walked into his arms, and he held her tight, his chin resting on top of her head. They stood there for a long moment, and Elizabeth felt something settle inside her. This was home. Not the house or the ranch or even the work. These people, this fragile, complicated connection, this was home. The back door creaked open, and Emma peeked in. "Are you done being mushy?" "Because I'm hungry." Jacob laughed, and Elizabeth pulled away to start making breakfast. Emma climbed back onto her stool, chattering about the chickens, and Jacob sat at the table watching them both with an expression Elizabeth had never seen before. Contentment. Maybe even happiness. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elizabeth let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. But Elizabeth should have known better than to trust happiness. It was a fleeting thing, fragile as glass, and the universe had a way of testing anyone who dared to reach for it. 3 weeks after that morning in the kitchen, Evelyn Brennan came back. But this time she didn't come alone. Elizabeth was hanging laundry when she saw the 2 wagons approaching. Evelyn was in the first one, and beside her sat a man Elizabeth didn't recognize. Older, well-dressed, with the kind of face that suggested he was used to being obeyed. The second wagon carried 2 more people, a younger couple who looked uncomfortable. Jacob emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. Elizabeth saw his expression darken when he recognized Evelyn. "Stay in the house," he said to Elizabeth as he walked past. "Who are they?" "Trouble." Elizabeth ignored his instruction and followed him to the front yard, drying her hands on her apron. Emma appeared from somewhere and attached herself to Elizabeth's side, her small hand gripping her skirt. Evelyn climbed down from the wagon, her smile sharp. "Jacob, So good to see you again. What do you want, Evelyn? I've brought some concerned citizens to speak with you. This is Mr. Whitmore, chairman of the county board. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson from the Children's Welfare Committee in Dodge. She gestured to each person in turn. They've heard some troubling things about the conditions out here. Jacob's jaw clenched. What conditions? Mr. Whitmore stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles. Mr. Calhoun, we've received reports that your daughter is not receiving proper education or socialization, that she's being raised in isolation by hired help rather than a suitable guardian. My daughter is fine. Is she? Whitmore looked at Emma, who was half hidden behind Elizabeth. When was the last time she attended school? When was the last time she spent time with other children? She doesn't need school. I teach her what she needs to know. Reading, writing, arithmetic, social graces? Mrs. Patterson spoke up, her voice pinched with disapproval. A child cannot be properly raised by a grieving father and a succession of cooks. She needs stability, structure, a mother's guidance. Elizabeth felt Emma's grip tighten on her skirt. She has everything she needs, Jacob said, his voice dangerously quiet. Does she? Evelyn stepped forward. Because from what I've observed, she's wild, undisciplined. She speaks rudely to adults and has no concept of proper behavior. And you, Jacob, you're so consumed with grief and work that you can barely care for yourself, let alone a child. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Evelyn's eyes glittered. The previous cooks all left because this household is unsuitable. And this current one, she gestured dismissively at Elizabeth. She's lasted a few months. How long before she leaves too? And what happens to Emma then? That's none of your business. It becomes everyone's business when a child's welfare is at stake, Whitmore said. We're here to conduct an assessment, Mr. Calhoun, to determine whether Emma should remain in your custody or be placed somewhere more appropriate. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Elizabeth felt her blood run cold. Jacob took a step toward Whitmore, his hands balled into fists. You're not taking my daughter. We're not here to take anyone. We're here to observe and make recommendations. Based on lies Evelyn told you. I've told them nothing but the truth, Evelyn said primly. That Emma is isolated, uneducated, and being raised in an unstable environment by a man who can't let go of his dead wife. Jacob lunged forward, and Elizabeth grabbed his arm, holding him back. Don't, she said quietly. That's what she wants. She wants you to lose control so they have proof you're unfit. Jacob looked at her, breathing hard, then turned back to Whitmore. Fine. Conduct your assessment, but you'll see that my daughter is healthy, happy, and well cared for. Whitmore nodded. We'll start with an interview. Emma, would you come here, please? Emma shrank further behind Elizabeth. No. Emma, it's all right, Elizabeth said gently. Just answer their questions. But they want to take me away. Nobody's taking you anywhere. You don't know that. Emma's voice was small and scared, nothing like her usual confidence. Elizabeth knelt down and looked the girl in the eyes. I promise you, we won't let anything happen to you, but you need to be brave right now. Can you do that? Emma nodded slowly, and Elizabeth walked her over to where Whitmore and the Pattersons were waiting. Jacob stood nearby, his arms crossed, watching like a hawk. The interview was painful to watch. They asked Emma about her daily routine, her education, her relationship with her father. She answered carefully at first, but Elizabeth could see her getting more anxious with each question. Do you miss your mother? Mrs. Patterson asked. Yes. Do you talk to your father about her? Sometimes. What does he say? Emma looked at Jacob, then back at Mrs. Patterson. He says she's gone and we have to keep living. And Miss Hartley? How long has she been here? A few months? Do you like her? Yes. Why? Because she's kind, and she makes Papa smile, and she reads to me and teaches me things. What kinds of things? Cooking and cleaning and how to... Emma stopped, looking uncertain. How to what, dear? How to not be lonely anymore. Mrs. Patterson exchanged a look with Whitmore. Has your father told you about his plans for the future? About possibly remarrying? Emma's expression hardened. He's not marrying Mrs. Brennan, if that's what you mean. Emma, Jacob started. I don't care, the girl said, her voice rising. I won't let them take me away from you and Elizabeth. I won't. She turned and ran into the house, the door slamming behind her. Elizabeth started to follow, but Jacob caught her arm. "Let me," he said. He went after Emma, leaving Elizabeth alone with the committee and Evelyn. The silence was suffocating. "Well," Whitmore said, making notes in a small book. "That was enlightening." "The child is clearly distressed," Mrs. Patterson added, "emotionally unstable." "She's scared," Elizabeth said sharply. "You're threatening to take her away from her father. Any child would be upset." "Miss Hartley, is it?" Whitmore looked at her over his spectacles. "How long exactly have you been employed here?" 3 months? "And in that time have you observed Mr. Calhoun to be a capable parent?" "Yes." "Has he ever lost his temper, behaved inappropriately around the child?" "No, never." "And yet he hired you without references, without any verification of your background or character." Elizabeth felt the trap closing. "I explained my situation. My previous employer had died. I had no references to give." "Convenient," Evelyn murmured. "What exactly are you implying?" Elizabeth asked. "Simply that a desperate man might make poor decisions, hiring strangers, allowing them unsupervised access to his child, forming—" Evelyn's smile was cruel. "Inappropriate attachments." Elizabeth's face burned. "There's nothing inappropriate happening here." "Isn't there? I've heard rumors from town about how you've settled in quite comfortably, how Mr. Calhoun looks at you, how you've positioned yourself as the new mistress of this household." "That's a lie." "Is it? Because from where I'm standing, you've done exactly what every other opportunistic woman would do. Found a grieving widower with land and convinced him he needs you." Elizabeth took a step forward, her hands shaking with rage. "You know nothing about me, or this family. You're just bitter because Jacob chose someone else over you." Evelyn's mask slipped, her expression twisting with fury. "Jacob didn't choose you. He's confused and grieving, and you took advantage of that. But I'll make sure everyone in this county knows exactly what kind of woman you are." "Enough," Whitmore said sharply. "Mrs. Brennan, please control yourself. Miss Hartley, I suggest you step back." Elizabeth forced herself to retreat, her heart pounding. This was going wrong. All of it. Evelyn had planned this perfectly, brought official witnesses, made accusations that would be hard to disprove, poisoned the well before they'd even had a chance to defend themselves. Jacob emerged from the house, his face grim. "Emma's upset. She won't talk to anyone right now." "That's concerning," Mrs. Patterson said, writing in her own notebook. "A well-adjusted child should be able to communicate even under stress." "She's 6 years old, and you're talking about taking her away from her home. What do you expect?" "We expect a child who's been properly raised to have the emotional tools to handle difficult situations." Jacob looked like he wanted to hit something. Instead, he turned to Whitmore. "Are we done here?" "Not quite. I'd like to see the child's living quarters, her educational materials, and I'd like to speak with you and Miss Hartley separately about the household arrangements." What followed were 2 of the longest hours of Elizabeth's life. They went through every room of the house, examining Emma's bedroom, asking about her daily schedule, questioning everything from the books on the shelf to the meals Elizabeth prepared. Whitmore took copious notes while Mrs. Patterson made disapproving noises, and Evelyn watched with barely concealed satisfaction. When they finally finished and climbed back into their wagons, Whitmore's expression was grave. "We'll be submitting our report to the county board next week," he said. "You'll be notified of our recommendations." "And what will those recommendations be?" Jacob asked. "I'm not at liberty to say at this time, but I will tell you, Mr. Calhoun, that the current situation is far from ideal. Emma needs stability, she needs proper education, and she needs a mother, a legal mother, not just hired help, however well-meaning." He tipped his hat and the wagons pulled away. Evelyn didn't even look back. Elizabeth, Jacob, and Emma stood in the yard watching them disappear down the road. The silence that followed felt like the aftermath of a storm. "They're going to take her," Jacob said quietly. "No, they're not." "You heard them. They think I'm unfit, that you're—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Elizabeth took his hand. "We'll fight this." "How?" "They're right about everything. I can't give Emma what she needs. I can't afford a proper school. I can't give her a mother because Catherine's dead, and I can't just—" "Stop." Elizabeth squeezed his hand hard. "Listen to me. You're a good father. Emma is happy here.
and we're not going to let them take her away. What choice do we have?" Elizabeth looked at him, then at Emma, who was standing on the porch with tears streaming down her face, and suddenly she knew what had to be done. It was reckless and impulsive and probably insane, but it was the only option that made sense. "Marry me," she said. Jacob stared at her. "What?" "Marry me. That's what they want, isn't it? Proof that Emma has a stable home with 2 parents, legal parents." Elizabeth's heart was racing, but her voice was steady. "We do it quickly, before they submit their report. Show them that Emma has exactly what they think she needs." "Elizabeth, you can't. That's not—" "Why not? We care about each other. We're already living as a family. The only thing missing is the legal paperwork." "You'd do that? Tie yourself to this mess just to protect Emma?"
"I'm already tied to this mess. And I'm not doing it just for Emma." She looked at him directly. "I'm doing it for all of us. Because this is where I want to be. This is where I choose to be." Jacob's expression was a war between hope and disbelief. "You're serious. Completely. But what if it doesn't work? What if they still take her? Then at least we tried. At least we fought for her instead of just giving up." Emma ran down from the porch and threw herself at Elizabeth. "You'd really marry Papa? You'd really stay?" Elizabeth hugged her tight. "Yes, if he'll have me." She looked up at Jacob, waiting. He stood there for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he pulled them both into his arms and held them like he was afraid they might disappear. "Yes," he said roughly. "Yes." They were married 4 days later by a traveling minister passing through Dodge City. It wasn't the kind of wedding anyone dreams about. No white dress, no flowers, no celebration. Just Elizabeth in her best dress, Jacob in his one good suit, Emma as witness, and a handful of strangers in the minister's parlor. But when Jacob slipped a plain gold band onto Elizabeth's finger, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, retrieved from a drawer where it had sat forgotten for years, and promised to honor and keep her, Elizabeth felt something shift inside her. This was real. This was binding. This was a choice they were both making, together. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed her gently, and Emma cheered loud enough to startle the other couples waiting their turn. They filed the marriage certificate with the county clerk that same afternoon, making sure it was official and recorded. Then they drove back to the ranch in the wagon, the 3 of them squeezed onto the bench seat. "Are you scared?" Emma asked Elizabeth. "Terrified." "But you did it anyway." "Yes. That's what brave means, right? Mama said being brave means doing things even when you're scared." Elizabeth put her arm around the girl. "Your mama was right about a lot of things." Jacob glanced at her, and Elizabeth saw something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. Not love. Not yet, maybe. But the possibility of it. The beginning of it. When they got home, Elizabeth changed out of her dress and made supper like it was any other night. But everything felt different. The house felt different. She was no longer the cook who might leave at any moment. She was Jacob's wife, Emma's stepmother. This was her home now, for better or worse. That night, after Emma went to bed, Jacob found Elizabeth on the porch. She was sitting on the steps, looking out at the dark prairie, trying to process everything that had happened. He sat down beside her. "You all right? Ask me tomorrow." "Having second thoughts?" "About a dozen. You?" "At least 20. He was quiet for a moment. "But I don't regret it." "Neither do I. We did this backwards, you know. Most people fall in love first and then get married." Elizabeth looked at him. "Who says we haven't?" Jacob met her eyes, and in the moonlight she could see the surprise on his face. "You love me?" "I don't know. Maybe. I think I'm getting there." She shrugged. "I've never been very good at figuring out what I feel, but I know I want to be here, with you and Emma, and I know I'd do just about anything to protect this family, so maybe that's close enough to love for now." Jacob reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Catherine wrote me a letter too, before she died. I found it a few months ago, hidden in her things." "What did it say?" "That I needed to forgive myself for not saving her, that I needed to let Emma be a child instead of treating her like she was fragile, and that when the right person came along, I shouldn't fight it. I should just—" His voice caught. "I should just let myself be happy again." "Do I make you happy?" "You terrify me.
But yeah, you do. Elizabeth laughed and leaned against his shoulder. They sat there in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, crickets and wind and the distant howl of a coyote. What do you think they'll say? Elizabeth asked. The committee. I don't know. But we've got documentation now, legal proof that Emma has 2 parents and a stable home. Will it be enough? It has to be. But the waiting was agony. Days stretched into a week, then 2, with no word from the county board. Elizabeth threw herself into work, cleaning, cooking, organizing, anything to keep her mind occupied. Jacob worked himself into exhaustion every day, coming in after dark covered in dirt and sweat. Emma bounced between nervous excitement and quiet fear, clinging to both of them like she was afraid they might vanish. Finally, 3 weeks after the assessment, a letter arrived. Jacob opened it with shaking hands while Elizabeth and Emma stood beside him. He read it once, then again, his expression carefully blank. What does it say? Elizabeth asked, her heart in her throat. Jacob looked at her, and slowly, his face split into a grin. They're recommending Emma remain in our custody. They've closed the investigation. Elizabeth felt her knees go weak. What? They said the marriage demonstrates our commitment to providing a stable home, and they noted that Emma appears well-adjusted despite her initial emotional reaction to the assessment. He laughed, a sound of pure relief. We won! Emma shrieked and threw herself at both of them, and they stood there in a tangle of arms and tears and laughter. Elizabeth couldn't stop shaking. They'd actually done it. They'd fought for their family and won. That night, they had a real celebration. Elizabeth made Emma's favorite foods, and Jacob opened a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. They ate and laughed and talked late into the evening, and for the first time since Elizabeth had arrived at the ranch, the house felt completely, genuinely happy. After Emma finally fell asleep, Elizabeth and Jacob sat together in the kitchen, exhausted but content. Thank you, Jacob said quietly, for what you did, for marrying me, for fighting for us. You don't have to thank me. I wanted to. Why? Elizabeth thought about it. Because somewhere along the way you stopped being my employer and became my family, and family is worth fighting for. Jacob reached across the table and took her hand. I never thought I'd feel this way again. After Catherine died, I thought that part of my life was over, that I'd just exist, get through the days, but you made me want to live again. Is that a good thing? It's terrifying, but yeah, it's good. Elizabeth squeezed his hand. For what it's worth, you make me want to stay in one place. I've spent my whole life running from things, bad situations, bad memories, bad luck. But this doesn't feel like something to run from. It feels like something to run toward. Even with all the mess, the grief and the complications and the small-minded people trying to tear us apart. Especially with all that. Because it's real. And I'm tired of things that aren't real. Jacob stood up and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Elizabeth breathed in the smell of him, earth and work, and something uniquely his, and felt herself relax completely for the first time in months. This was home. Not the house, or the land, or even the work. This feeling right here, being held by someone who saw her, flaws and all, and chose her anyway. I love you, Jacob said against her hair. I know it's fast and probably crazy, but I do. Elizabeth pulled back to look at him. You're right, it is crazy. But I love you too. He kissed her then, deep and real and full of promise. And Elizabeth let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, broken things could be put back together. That families could be built from scattered pieces. That love didn't have to look perfect to be worth having. The months that followed weren't easy. Evelyn spread rumors around town, calling Elizabeth every name she could think of and trying to convince people that the marriage was a sham. Some folks believed her, others didn't. But gradually, as they saw Jacob and Elizabeth together, at church socials, at the general store, at town meetings, the talk died down. Elizabeth enrolled Emma in the school in Dodge City, driving her in twice a week for lessons. The girl struggled at first, unused to other children and formal education, but she adapted faster than anyone expected. She made friends, learned to read better, and came home full of stories about what she'd learned. The ranch thrived. With Elizabeth managing the household efficiently, Jacob had more time to focus on the cattle and the land. They hired a hand to help with the heavy work, and slowly,
The place began to look less like a desperate operation and more like a real working ranch. Winter came, blanketing everything in snow. Elizabeth learned to love the stark beauty of the prairie in December, the way the wind howled across the empty fields, the way the snow made everything clean and new. She learned to bake bread in the temperamental stove, to preserve vegetables for the cold months, to keep the house warm when the temperature dropped below freezing. And she learned to be part of a family. It wasn't always smooth. There were fights about money, about Emma's education, about Jacob working too hard and Elizabeth taking on too much. There were moments when the ghost of Catherine felt too present, when Elizabeth wondered if she'd ever really belong in this house. There were nights when Jacob woke from nightmares about losing everyone he loved, and Elizabeth had to hold him until he remembered that she was still there. But there were also mornings when she woke to find Emma curled up between them, having snuck into their room during the night. There were evenings when Jacob came in from work early just to sit with her while she cooked, talking about nothing and everything. There were Sundays when they'd all pile into the wagon and drive to town, looking like any other family. One evening in early spring, almost a year after Elizabeth had first arrived, she was sitting on the porch with Emma. The girl was reading aloud from her schoolbook, practicing her letters, and Elizabeth was mending one of Jacob's shirts. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said suddenly. "Of course." "Do you ever talk to Mama?" Elizabeth set down her sewing. "What do you mean?" "Like I do. Do you ever feel like she's still here, watching us?" Elizabeth thought about the humming she'd heard, the objects that moved, the feeling of being observed. She'd stopped noticing those things months ago. Or maybe they'd just stopped happening. "I used to feel that way," she said carefully, "but not anymore." "Me neither." Emma looked up at her. "I think she left. I think once you and Papa got married, she knew we'd be okay, so she could go." "How do you feel about that?" "Sad, but also okay, because I think she wanted this. She wanted us to be a family." Emma closed her book. "I'm glad she chose you." Elizabeth pulled the girl close. "I'm glad she chose me too." "Do you think she'd be happy if she could see us now?" "I think she'd be proud of all of us." Jacob came around the corner of the house then, covered in dust from fixing the barn roof. He looked at the two of them sitting together on the porch and smiled, that real, genuine smile that Elizabeth had learned to treasure. "What are you two plotting?" he asked. "Nothing," Emma said innocently. "Just talking about how lucky we are." "Lucky, huh?" "Very lucky." Emma jumped up. "I'm going to check on the chickens." She ran off, leaving Elizabeth and Jacob alone. He sat down on the porch beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "She's not wrong," he said. "We are lucky. Even with everything we went through to get here? Especially because of that." Jacob turned to look at her. "You know what I realized the other day?" "What?" "I can't remember the last time I thought about how hard things are. I used to wake up every morning dreading the day. Now I wake up, and the first thing I think about is you, and how much better everything is with you in it." Elizabeth felt her eyes sting. "You're getting sentimental in your old age. I'm 34. Ancient." He laughed and kissed her temple. "You planning to keep me around?" "I might, if you're useful. I'm very useful. We'll see." They sat there as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The prairie stretched out before them, endless and beautiful, and home. Elizabeth thought about the woman she'd been when she first arrived, desperate, guarded, convinced that she'd never belong anywhere. And she thought about the woman she was now, still flawed, still carrying scars, but no longer alone. That night, after Emma was asleep and the house was quiet, Elizabeth found the box of letters in Catherine's old room. She sat on the floor and went through them one by one, reading the words of a dying woman to the family she was leaving behind. The last letter was addressed simply, "To my family." Elizabeth opened it with trembling hands. "If you're reading this together, all three of you, then my plan worked." Emma found the right person. Jacob let them in. "And whoever you are, you chose to stay. I don't know your name or your story, but I know you're brave. I know you're kind. And I know you love my family, because you wouldn't be here if you didn't. Thank you for giving them what I couldn't, a future. Thank you for making my daughter smile again. Thank you for pulling my husband out of the darkness I left him in. Thank you for being the missing piece this family needed. You're not replacing me. You're completing something I started but couldn't finish. And I'm grateful. Take care of them. Love them. Fight for them. They're worth it. And know that somewhere, wherever I am, I'm watching and I'm happy. With all my love, Catherine. Elizabeth folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box. Then she stood up, wiped her eyes, and walked out of the room. She closed the door behind her, not locking it, not sealing it off, just closing it gently, respectfully. Some ghosts didn't need to be exorcised. They just needed to be honored. She went back to the bedroom she now shared with Jacob and found him already asleep, one arm stretched out across her side of the bed like he was reaching for her even in his dreams. She climbed in beside him, and he immediately pulled her close, mumbling something incoherent into her hair. Elizabeth closed her eyes and let herself feel it, all of it. The fear and the hope and the love and the uncertainty. Because that's what family was. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. It was messy and complicated, and sometimes it fell apart and had to be rebuilt from scratch. But it was worth it. Every terrifying, beautiful, impossible moment of it was worth it. And as she drifted off to sleep in the arms of a man who'd started as a stranger and become her home, Elizabeth Hartley, now Elizabeth Calhoun, understood something that had eluded her all her life. You didn't find family. You built it. One choice at a time, one fight at a time, one moment of courage at a time. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, broken people could come together and make something whole. Not perfect, never perfect, but real and lasting, and worth every single struggle it took to get there. In the end, that was the only thing that mattered. Not how you started, not what you lost along the way, but who you chose, and who chose you back.